And now the layoffs are picking up too. The US labor market has been in danger, flirting with the cliff for quite some time. We've been getting bits and pieces, little fragments suggesting that the danger has been rising of falling right off the cliff and into the flat part of the Beveridge curve. But it's no longer just small fragments any longer. And I'll go over what all of this means and why the Beveridge curve in its flat part means everything right now. What the latest data shows is that layoffs are already picking up. It isn't huge, but it's there, and more importantly, growing. The demand for labor has dropped right into that danger zone where it gets to be low enough companies don't just stop hiring, they begin firing. Now, we already know they haven't been hiring, and in this update, the data shows they really haven't been hiring, confirmed by yet another recession-level rate. That didn't change with the Fed's rate cuts, nor after the results of the last election. And American workers know it. Even if there's total silence in the mainstream media on this, employees aren't quitting in droves. This is the opposite of the Great Resignation. Quits are at a news cycle low because employees know there is no place for them to go if they do end up leaving. And with layoffs on the rise, leaving might not be voluntary. And while the mainstream is ignoring all this because Jay Powell's back to chasing the CPI, there is an anomaly, a couple of them actually, in the oil market directly related to the labor market cliff. Gas prices should be shooting higher right now, but they're not. Instead, inventories are really starting to build. And after being incredibly low more recently, gas stocks are rising, keeping a lid on prices simply because demand isn't there. The gas glut is here, driven by an economy that is being driven off of the cliff into the flat part of the Beveridge curve. What we do know, and what the latest data shows from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the government agency that also does the payroll report, is that there continues to be no hiring. The hiring rate from the JOLTS survey absolutely crashed yet again, down to just 5.269 million, just a little bit less than 5.3 million for the month of November 2024. Remember, JOLTS is a month behind the payroll report. That's down sharply from the upward revised 5.4 million in October, but more importantly, November gets it right back down to the shocking June low, which suggests that the June number and then a couple ones after that were not anomalies. It wasn't just the summertime weakness. The weakness continued after September, which was the anomaly, the high side anomaly, just like the payroll report. And that weakness returned immediately thereafter. So September was the only one out of the last 6 months, 7 months, suggesting that there was any strength in hiring, and even it wasn't that great. Instead, what we're getting is a consistent picture of recession levels of hiring, which gets us to the discussion on the Beveridge curve and the labor market cliff, which I'll get to in just a few minutes here. And it's even worse when you look at it in terms of the hiring rate, which you should always do. So you take the JOLTS number of hires and divide it by the non-institutional population, and what you get is 1.96% for both November as well as June. And that 1.96% is equal to the middle of 2014, which gets us into the same territory as the early 2010s, when the labor force participation rate kept crashing because there wasn't enough jobs, there wasn't enough hiring to keep everyone engaged in the labor force. And by the way, that's exactly what we're seeing here. The labor force in 2023 and 2024 has been dropping, and it dropped sharply in the last couple months in October and November because of exactly what we're seeing here in JOLTS. Companies are not hiring, and so those who would like to enter the workforce and those who are in the workforce but can't find jobs, they both exited the official labor force, but they still count in an economy that is increasingly falling on hard times. And so the 1.96% hiring rate for November, not only is that equal to the early part of the 2010s in recovery mode or lack of recovery mode, it's equal to August and September of 2008, showing you just how bad the rate of hiring has become. Businesses don't want to hire people because they're not seeing either business at the current level or they're not seeing it coming in down the road. No matter what has happened over the last several months, the Fed, the Trump election, businesses are not acting like anything has changed. And unlike the establishment survey, the higher rate from JOLTS actually is corroborated by a lot of data all across the labor market, starting with the CPS, or a household survey, and the unemployment, or even the official count of unemployment itself. If you measure just the raw level of hires, the seasonally adjusted number of hires, not even the rate here, with the official number of unemployed, what you see is there's a very close correlation. If anything, this low level of hiring indicates the adjusted level of unemployment that I use whenever the payroll report comes out is much closer to accurate. And the adjusted unemployment that I come up with accounts for the labor force participation decline, which is consistent with the low level of hiring, and therefore adds back the labor force dropouts who have dropped out because no one is hiring. Again, the consistent theme. And so this low of a hiring rate indicates either that the unemployment is already higher than it is, or with such low levels of hiring, unemployment is about to be much higher because level of hiring leads to unemployment. That's been the case in every cycle throughout modern economic history, but now we have the data for it. So keep that in mind for the Beveridge curves because that's what the Beveridge curve is helping us identify. At least loosely speaking, the point at which lack of hiring, lack of demand for labor becomes too low that companies begin to fire them. Through the rest of the JOLTS numbers, the quits. Quits actually corroborate and validate everything we just said with hiring. According to the BLS for JOLTS, in November, 3.065 million, which is a new cycle low. And that's even before we adjust that to a rate, which here we adjust it by the level of establishment survey payrolls. That's down from 3.283 million in October, which might have been skewed because of hurricanes. Maybe a lot of people had to quit their jobs. Whatever the case, instead, quitting continues to decline on a pretty steady pace, which suggests that American workers know they can't leave where they are. And when there's this little turnover in the labor market, that's not a good sign. If you're stuck being an employee where you maybe don't want to be an employee, you're not willing to quit because you can't take that risk, that doesn't say anything good about the entire labor market situation. And the more people that are in that situation, the same situation that you're in, the worse you know it is. And so the current quits number, that's similar to what we saw 2008 heading into the deeper part of the Great Recession too. That's how little labor turnover there is, all because no one is hiring. American workers know the job market is worse than poor, even if you don't hear about it anywhere in the mainstream media. But here's the new thing that we're getting from JOLTS and a couple other sources beside. Layoffs are beginning to rise, and not just a couple months or two, they're beginning to stick around and move on an accelerated pace upward. According to the latest figures for November, layoffs and discharges totaled about 1.765 million, which was up from October at 1.748 million. And October was revised higher by 115,000, so already a big increase there. But more importantly, the 6-month average for layoffs and discharges, according to JOLTS, hit 1.7 million for the first time since April of 2021. And it's getting increasingly alarming in terms of private layoffs in the private sector, which is something that we keep coming back to, even in the establishment survey and the payroll reports that are being supported in a lot of ways by government hiring. So private layoffs, that 6-month average there hit 1.6 million, also for the first time since April of 2021. Now, these layoffs numbers are not huge by historical comparisons. They're still relatively tame. However, they're moving in the wrong direction, getting higher, and they're starting to get into the same range as historical territory, suggesting that something big is underway, some big time shift is underway in the labor market. And it dates back to around March, April, and May, the same inflection that we keep coming back to all over the global economy. So here we have lack of hiring, no one is quitting, and now more than just this tiny trickle of additional layoffs. It's starting to suggest and starting to look like the U.S. economy is indeed heading for the Beveridge cliff. But before getting to that, I got to address job openings, in part because job openings are part of the Beveridge curve. But job openings, those increased sharply in the month of November. They got back above 8 million, in fact, almost 8.1 million. And they're up 726,000 seasonally adjusted over the last 2 months. So everything that you've heard about JOLTS likely has to do with job openings because the media loves to hype it. Ever since Janet Yellen in 2014 gave that interview where she said, job openings are right there on my labor market dashboard, right near the top, right next to the establishment survey. And ever since then, first of all, not only has the media paid too much attention to job openings, the job openings data itself has gotten increasingly unreliable, yet it's still trotted out there as the perfect example of strength in labor market resilience, demand for workers, when it's none of those things. So outside of how we're going to use it in the Beveridge curve, never take the job openings number at face value. In fact, the more important stuff in JOLTS is especially hires, but also quits and now layoffs. Job openings is the least important part of it, the last thing that you should pay attention to. And yet, with all that in mind, we're going to pay attention to the job openings and the job openings rate because it's part of the Beveridge curve. It's a measure of potential labor demand. And it's safe to use it here in this context because if it is the most optimistic and charitable view of labor demand, then our measurements are going to be ultra conservative when we're trying to figure out this flat part cliff in the Beveridge curve. So what is the Beveridge curve? The Beveridge curve purports to measure the demand for labor against the supply for labor. And demand for labor, like I said, we're going to use JOLTS job openings. On the other side is the unemployment rate, which is a measure of the amount of spare workers in the economy. So the vertical part of the Beveridge curve, that's where hiring takes place. More importantly, what we're after is the flat part of the Beveridge curve. That's where hiring continues to drop, and therefore the demand for work continues to drop, in this case pictured by job openings, the amount of help wanted ads that are published in the economy. It gets so weak that companies don't just stop hiring, they don't just stop posting help wanted ads, they actively begin letting go some of their workers. So we're looking for that spot on the Beveridge curve where hiring and therefore posting help wanted ads gets to be low enough that we see the flat part, which is where unemployment starts to rise sharply. It's that point when demand for labor drops far enough, companies won't just stop posting help wanted ads or even hiring new workers. They start firing the ones they have because demand has fallen off so much, they realize they have too many of them. So the cliff and Beveridge curve is a little bit misleading in terms of analogy, but it's the flat part of the curve, the transition from the vertical part to the flat part. And when you plot the Beveridge curve over the last couple of years, the current cycle, what you see is we're right in that danger zone. So right where we are with the current data, that's where the vertical meets the flat part. And if you make it just an easy adjustment to job openings to make them a little more sane, less elevated, less unrealistic, it shows that we're spot on with 2007 and 2008. But here's the thing. We have lots of other data, including everything I just went over, that suggests the same thing as what we're talking about here. The Beveridge curve just pictures what might be that transition from the vertical to the flat part, but hiring and quits and the household survey and the adjusted unemployment rate, all of those things suggest that we're either at that inflection point on the Beveridge cliff or we may have already gone past it. That might be what JOLTS layoffs are telling us and a whole bunch of other statistics beside. And you see this level of corroboration all throughout the data, from JOLTS hires, quits, the Beveridge curve, the relationship between JOLTS hires and the official count of unemployed, the adjusted count of unemployed. It starts to make a whole lot of sense. And then you add into it income data, market positions, including, as we'll go over here, gasoline and oil prices, more so gasoline. And it starts to look a lot like what you would imagine for an economy transitioning to recession, and nothing like what you hear in the mainstream media that has focused solely on either job openings or Jay Powell's opinion on more so consumer prices lately than actual labor market trouble. But the labor market trouble is right there, and it is serious enough when you put it in the context of the Beveridge curve that we should be more and more concerned about unemployment rising, not just because businesses aren't hiring, but because we've gone past that point of no return, and they are actually starting to fire them. So gasoline prices, wholesale gasoline in the U.S. Normally what happens with gasoline is early December, they stop falling and start rising. For seasonal reasons. There's a bunch of different seasonal reasons, including the fact that we have to switch over to winter formulation. You got to use all the fall stuff. So there's a point at which gasoline inventories and supply gets thinned out. Prices tend to rise right from the early part of December. And historically, that's where it begins. Late November, early December, you see the rise in wholesale gasoline prices. Sometimes it can be delayed as late as Christmas, but this year, it hasn't really shown up at all. Gasoline prices that should be rising really aren't. You see over the last couple of years, very, very clearly what I just described. In 2023 and 2024, gasoline prices bottomed out in December, same thing as the year before and the year before that. And by the time you get to this part in January, last year, 2024, gasoline prices, wholesale prices, were still relatively low, but around $2.10 per gallon, $2.11, moving on up to the 20s and beyond there. In January 2023, on the seasonal upswing, wholesale gasoline to CME was already at $2.40. And in 2022, it was $2.35 to $2.40, even before we got to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the energy crisis that kicked off. Right now, by contrast, wholesale gasoline is right about $2 per gallon and falling. It only got as high as $2.04 the last couple days, and there was no detectable seasonal bottom in anywhere in December, either in the early part or even around Christmas time, suggesting that the market has been unusually weak. And I know that's weird to say. Gasoline prices aren't falling, which suggests that there's a very unusual weakness in the marketplace, but that's exactly what we're seeing here. The marketplace has become more than normalized to the lack of demand, and prices aren't behaving even like they would normally for this time of year. It goes right along with the labor market data that we just went over, the lack of hiring, maybe some firing. There isn't any demand for energy, and the energy market knows it regardless of however much supply or inventories there are of crude or gasoline. So the latest labor market data that we have in the United States, hiring, we've known that all along, really since the shocking low came up in the June estimate. But the June estimate proved not to be some outlier, just the first one of more to follow. The lack of hiring in the real economy is a major and growing problem, corroborated by the rest of the JOLT series, which suggests American workers know that there's no one hiring out there, so their staying place quits are the opposite of the Great Resignation. At the same time, we're now seeing layoffs start to trickle higher as well, all of which gets us into that danger zone, falling off the cliff of the Beveridge curve into the flat part of it. And more data continues to align with that direction, suggesting that at the very least, we're in that danger zone, potentially right next to the inflection point, and quite a lot more that's suggesting, including this layoff number, that the economy, the labor market may have already gone past it. And in the oil market, energy market, gasoline prices, which should be shooting higher just for seasonal reason, this time they're not doing that because the energy market knows there's no risk of demand surging, and there's a greater risk of demand falling. So we have a ton of consistent and corroborated evidence that suggests, number one, no one is hiring. American workers know it, they aren't quitting. Layoffs are starting to trickle higher. We got government data, we've got private data, we've got marketplace prices, all of it pointing to, at the very best, being in that inflection part of the Beveridge curve, the danger zone, and quite a lot more that increasingly suggests that we may have already gone past it, right off the labor market cliff onto the flat part of the Beveridge curve, which is the place you never want to be. That seems to be the same verdict that European banks are making about the situation in Europe and its labor market. I went over what European banks are up to in the video linked below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members, Eurodollar University subscribers, and until next time, take care.